Welcome everyone to our advisor forum today. I'm so glad to see so many of you here. Our session, Advisors as Social Justice Advocates, a primer. Our presenter is Dr. Kyler Sherman-Wilkins, an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Kyler, as always, thank you for your willingness to present at an advisor forum, and I'm excited to turn it over to you.
All right, can everyone hear me and hopefully see the slides? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Ross, for another opportunity to come and share a bit about something that I care very much about, which is specifically advising students from historically excluded groups. For today's presentation, I want to focus specifically on advisors as social justice advocates. I would like to preface this, as I do with most of my talks on this topic, is that I consider myself to be very much a student in this area, simply because I think that being an advisor, especially an advisor who's operating through the lens of social justice, is a lifelong learning type of thing. One doesn't become an expert where they just check off a checkbox once they've read a certain number of materials or sat through a couple of trainings. And so, though I spend a lot of time thinking about this and certainly want to incorporate social justice in my advising practice, I'm a student as well, and I think it's just really important to start off with that. Thank you all for being here. I think this is a very appropriate forum to cap off Black History Month, as we'll be talking about a lot of the issues that specifically impact students of color, but also more broadly students that have other types of systemic disadvantages presented to them at the university level. So I want to talk about a couple of things. First, I want to set the stage. Why is it that social justice is such an important part of advising practice, or why is it increasingly becoming an important part of advising practice? And then defining what social justice is. There are all these different definitions that tend to be circulated, but I want to have a consensus, at least what we're going to be operating from for this talk, and how it pertains to advising specifically. And then lastly, how do we apply social justice to advising, right? What does it mean to be a social justice advisor, or an advisor who operates through the lens of social justice? Spoiler alert, it's difficult. It's difficult work, but it's necessary work. And so I hope that you all will see a need for applying this lens to your advising practice and work on developing some of the, or implementing some of the strategies that can help you be a better advisor from a social justice perspective. And then hopefully we'll have time for Q&A. I believe this is an hour long, right? Okay, so hopefully, I'm usually long-winded, especially when it comes to things I care about. So, but I'll try to leave enough time for some questions and answers, because I think that many of you might have your own questions or particular issues that you want to bring up. And I think it might be valuable to have a conversation about this topic as well.
Yeah, and hey, Kyler, it's Rob. I just want to let you know that we're seeing multiple screens. So if you wanted to do the display settings, so we just see the screen that you're on.
I have no idea how to do that.
It's up at the top where it says display settings.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Oh, I see.
There you go. Thanks, Kyler.
Okay, okay, perfect. Yeah. Good to know. I don't want to spoil the surprise of the next slide. So thank you for that. Okay, so let's talk about setting the stage a bit. So I think it's pretty obvious that there are certain students, Missouri State population, this is of course across all universities, that face specific types of disadvantage that's due solely to their social location or their social group membership. So we know that first generation college students have particular challenges. Non-traditional students, these are students who typically are older than their peers. Transfer students, and then of course students from socioeconomically disadvantaged groups or classes. And then of course LGBTQ plus students, particularly our trans students, especially now. And so we're probably aware of this. There have been calls to address some of these issues. We know that cultural competence is one of our 3 pillars, and whether or not we actually ascribe to that day by day is an open question, but at least we have it as an ideal. And so with this in mind, it's really important for us to think about every day, how can we as advisors, or how can we as professionals who work with students, how do we help to address some of these issues that quite frankly prevent our students from just being students, right? Worrying about exams and classes, and popularity, I guess. I don't know if that's what college students really concern themselves about these days. So how do we address some of the extra things that that end up preventing our students from just being students and being able to thrive in a university setting with the challenges that college provides to all people, right? And so this is something that happened in 2020, but I think it's worth remembering because I think about it often, and I want to make sure that folks who are not familiar with this this occurrence are familiar. And that, of course, is the Black at No State hashtag. This again was in 2020, and it was largely in reaction to the university's response to the George Floyd killing, and specifically some events on campus that I don't want to go into too much, but I just want to show a couple of the tweets that were shared by Missouri State students, some of whom are actually still currently students at the university. Some of these were alum, but also students who are currently students. So this one, I was called the N-word when Trump came to campus my freshman year. The lady didn't know me at all. And when I went to school about it, meaning the university, I was told not to worry about it because she was only there for Trump. Another, being constantly told by your advisor that you should change your major because she doesn't think you're intelligent enough to be pre-med. I was told I don't think the field of medicine is for you. Another, does Missouri State deserve us? That's my question. We spend thousands of dollars for them to take the credit of giving us a degree and any of our other many accomplishments, yet we get nothing in return. I thought this was particularly telling and interesting, having literally one Black professor the entire 137 credit hours, Black at No State, right? So these are particular tweets that highlight the experiences of our Black students in particular, that again, I would argue, prevent them from just being students, right? And focusing on what you would expect a college student to focus on. They're now focusing on racism, quite frankly, and being the victims of individual racism, in the latter sense of the last tweet rather, structural racism, right? Preventing us from having representation in terms of Black faculty. But it's not just our students of color or Black students that are impacted by some of these barriers or structural types of disadvantage. We also see attacks on trans rights, right? There are currently 5 bills in the Missouri legislature that seek to restrict transgender rights in various ways. One that will basically criminalize gender affirming treatments for trans youth, which, by the way, is oftentimes a matter of life and death, right? Not being able to receive these treatments can actually greatly impact the mental health of trans youth, leading to suicide. So we have that. We also have bills such as the Parents' Bill of Rights, which may seem to be kind of innocuous, but actually does prevent schools from talking about issues of gender identity, sexuality, et cetera. And then, of course, we have the infamous trans athlete bans. We also see this happening when it comes to reproductive rights. This is just highlighting abortion laws. And what I'm trying to do here is illustrate that there are these larger things happening in our broader society at the state level, national level, et cetera, that are on a lot of students' minds, especially students who belong to a particular disadvantaged group, right? And so keeping that in mind is really important when we're thinking about how do we best address the needs of our students, that it's not just classroom issues or issues that they have with the professor. There are these larger structural and social forces that are shaping their experiences at the individual level, right? Okay. So that's setting the stage. A bit more to set the stage is the idea of what is oppression, what does it look like, and how do we differentiate between different levels? So I like this. This comes from the National Equity Project. And they have this Venn diagram where they look at the two different levels of oppression. So we have the individual level oppression and we have the systemic. And typically we as people tend to focus on the individual level. We're kind of primed to do that from a very young age. We're socialized to be very, individualistic and to not think too much about systems. And so the individual is what we're most familiar with. And that tends to reflect the person's beliefs and actions that serve to perpetuate oppression. So usually when we're trying to intervene, we intervene at that level, right? We have people do trainings for cultural competence, like how to not stereotype, implicit bias training, et cetera. But those are, again, individual level, and they're important for sure. But by focusing solely on the individual, we're ignoring these larger systems that certainly do impact or they may increase the chances that someone might engage in these individual level types of oppressive acts, right? The interpersonal is kind of that bridge between the individual and institutional or structural. But I want to focus on the institutional and structural specifically because these are the more challenging types of systems to try to address or dismantle, systems of oppression, that is. And also where I want to focus the advising piece is a social advocate piece on the institutional and structural. So institutional reflects policies and practices at the organization or sector level. So that would be, for example, higher ed, institutes of higher learning. What are the types of barriers or oppressive systems that exist in higher ed? And then you have the structural, which is how these effects interact and accumulate across institutions. So this would be more nationwide, right? The whole idea of the United States and structural racism at the country level would be an example of that, right? So again, I want to focus specifically on structural and institutional. However, it's really important to note that the individual is also worth attending to. But again, most of the trainings that people typically go through are focused on individual level changes, right? And while those are certainly difficult, I would argue it's much harder and oftentimes a bit more challenging to motivate people to institute or advocate for a change at the institutional and structural level. Okay, so you probably have seen this. I apologize if you've seen this, but I feel that oftentimes repetition is key. And if you haven't seen this, you're welcome. But this is what is social justice? This is a panel that looks at 4 different, structures, right? We have reality on one end, and we have liberation, which is also known as social justice on the other end. And so basically you have a fence, right? And all 3 of the panels, you have a fence and it's blocking view of the game, right? And reality tells us that not everyone is starting off at a level playing field, so to speak, right? So we have one person who is literally in a hole, so of course they cannot see the game. We have one person who's kind of struggling to, peer over the fence, and then we have another person who has all of these resources, or in this case, boxes that allow him or them, rather, I don't know, to see the entire game, right? Equality is the mindset that everyone is given equal amounts, right, of a material good. So in this case, a box. But what we notice is that the shortest person, littlest person, still is not able to see the game even when they are given a box, right? Equity is a model in which you give to those what they need for them to be successful, right? And so in this particular case, you have the person who's the tallest doesn't get a box because they don't need a box, right? Whereas the person who's the shortest gets 2 boxes. And the idea behind social justice is that you just remove the fence entirely. You don't need to necessarily provide boxes because everyone has equal access to the game. There's no barrier, there's no fence preventing them from seeing the game, right? And so that's oftentimes how social justice or liberation is discussed. I know there are some social justice advocates who kind of reject this. Not, I think it's overly simplistic, but I think it does a pretty good job of capturing what the goal is as it pertains to moving toward a more socially just society. Okay. So picture's worth 1,000 words. I thought this is really useful as a way to get us thinking about what social justice might look like. But in terms of definitions that I like, this comes from NACADA's social justice advising community. And if you're not familiar with NACADA, it is a global community of academic advisors, really great resource. I learn a lot from NACADA, and I recommend their website and their social justice advising community. And so they define social justice as an acknowledgement that we live in an inequitable world and that each of us has a responsibility to work towards a more empowering society. And I would also add not only a responsibility, but the power to do so, right? And I think that oftentimes some of the reluctance, or perhaps the reason why we don't see more people engaging in more social justice or advocating at a structural institutional level, typically is because they don't know how, right? They don't believe they have the power to do so. But hopefully after this presentation, you'll be able to identify specific things that you can do and understand that you do have power, okay? One other thing that I would like to say about social justice, and you want to think about it in terms of privilege and material goods and wealth, et cetera. It's basically, how do we more equitably distribute material goods, power, privileges across society, right? That's the idea, put it in another way. Okay. So what does advising through the lens of social justice look like? Well, I want to start off by saying what it does not look like. And I think this tends to, I've seen this happen a couple of times, and so much so that I thought it would be worth mentioning this, because I do think that oftentimes when people adopt practices of social justice, they tend to fall into the category of what we call white savior complex. And we can apply this not just to white advisors advising students of color. We can also advise this, we can say this with cisgender people advising trans individuals, right? It's this idea of being a savior as opposed to being an advocate. And while I really do love Hilary Swank, in Freedom Riders, this really captures this idea that this white teacher comes in and basically saves these underprivileged youth, right? Great actress, poor film, right? In terms of really adopting this savior complex. And I had this conversation in the previous presentation I presented in their own words, after discussing with some students, student advisees. And this is something that really, I think, captures this idea of white savior complex and how we want to avoid doing this in our advising practice. But so this is from a Black woman, undergrad. I believe she graduated. So congratulations, T. But sometimes I don't think white people get it. It's not my job to make them feel good about themselves. I don't need someone to swoop in and save me to benefit their ego. I want to feel supported here, so I just want them to listen, right? And again, I think this is anecdotal, but it shows this broader pattern. And you can apply this to other situations in which you have someone from a more privileged status advising someone from a less privileged status of being a savior, right? And I would argue that this statement or this quotation kind of illustrates a lack of perhaps trust and relationship between the advisee and the advisor, and also this perception that the person only cares because they want to benefit their ego, right? They want to be considered non-problematic, right? So this is one thing I think is important to avoid as we're trying to engage in more of this social justice perspective, is not wanting to come across as being a savior. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that we can advise in such a way where we are not perceived? Well, I would start off by saying that part of it is developing that really close relationship with students. Students should be able to see their advisors and their faculty members and their, people who work with them in their own spaces, right? How many of you have been to the Multicultural Resource Center, for example, and just been there? Students congregate there all the time, right? And seeing their advisor walk around touring the space or just spending some time there would be, I think, a great way to show someone that you actually care. Showing up to events, right? Black History Month is over, but we have Women's History Month next month. Multicultural programs throws all of these events. Student groups oftentimes organize these events. And I know with COVID-19 and everything that it becomes more challenging to do so, but a lot of these things are held virtually. And so I would encourage individuals to take the time to show up in these spaces so that students can see you, right? And that goes above and beyond this superficial notion of, oh, I have to do this because advising has moved in this direction. No, you're actually showing that you're committed to this type of work. So that's one way. Also, we can adopt language that helps us to avoid this savior complex. So what we can do is, instead of approaching it as something that you as an advisor can do or must do for a student, think about how you can support what the student can or must do, right? So this is where it gets into the empowerment as opposed to I'm going to save you. This is what I will do, right? Now, that being said, there are still some things that you as an advisor can and must do, right? It doesn't let you off the hook. But in terms of what you're communicating, it's less about what I'm going to do for you and more about what can we do together and how can I empower you to make those necessary steps to improve your outcomes, right? The other piece is knowing your limits. This is something that I think can be difficult for most, if not all, is understanding that there is a difference between an advisor versus mentor. And sometimes there might be students who don't feel as comfortable, right? And so understand that historically excluded group members may relate better to people with perceived similarities, right? And so, for example, I oftentimes get a number of students of color who come to me. I'm not their formal advisor, but they want to talk to me because they perceive that we have similar experiences, or that I get what it means to be Black in America. And I can say I certainly do. Right. So those are types of things that are also really important to note. And I think the sign of someone who is an anti-savior is one who identifies who those people might be to connect their advisees to those individuals and not feel threatened that someone else might be a better fit for their advisee for a particular concern or for a particular time period. Right. And hopefully we have this mindset that we can let go, right? Because again, the idea is how do we serve our students the best, not how do we, collect brownie points for being a best advisor in a situation, right? It's about the student. Okay. So this helps to set the stage a bit, but also I wanted to acknowledge what bad social justice advising looks like, or advising from a social justice perspective. It should not be this savior idea. I now want to turn to the resource that I used to help kind of formulate my own thoughts and on this topic, and that is Pocket Guide, which Ross and Laura made me aware of, I think last year or 2 years ago. They have all these pocket guides for NACADA, which are really, really cool resources that kind of walk you through best practices for particular types of advising. And this one was really something that spoke to me and I felt was exciting. So I want to give credit where credit is due. They have this academic advising and social justice and advocacy approach, which really does capture the reasons why social justice application to advising is ideal. It also really provides some very concrete tips that are rooted in theoretical models, which I'll talk about in a second, and also just kind of like more like, best practices. And I want to summarize some of the arguments there and put my own little spin on them a bit for the remainder of the presentation. Okay, so one of the things that they noted, which I think is really important to remember, is that there are a number of strengths that advisors have that puts us in a very specific or unique position to be able to advocate for our students from a social justice perspective. One of those strengths is recognizing barriers that exist in the university, right? Hopefully, we as advisors spend some time understanding what types of things exist in the university and what barriers might exist specifically for some of our students. And I understand that people have different relationships to advising. I know I'm talking to both professional advisors who are staff advisors and also faculty advisors who may not have as much time dedicated to advising, but hopefully we spend some time understanding that there are barriers that exist in the university for some of our students. The second thing that is a strength is understanding the levers of power, right? We should know, ideally we should know, what the hierarchy looks like, who holds power in the university setting, what is the responsibility of the associate provost, for example, or the provosts versus the deans versus department heads versus the president of the university, right? We should know what those levers of power are, who operates them, and who can pull them into what effect, right? And then lastly, ideally, is establish trust with students, right? This is another thing that advisors bring to the table. Advocacy, especially advocating for individuals, requires a level of trust. Certainly, it requires trust to be able to coherently and intelligently speak with authority as to what people might need or what they might be going through. And that requires trust, right? You cannot get a sense of what is really bothering or impacting students unless you have then confide some of those things in you. And that requires this level of trust, right? So the argument here is that because advisors have a specific relationship with students, because they should ideally kind of straddle this relationship between academic affairs and also more staff or student affairs rather, then they're well positioned to be these greater advocates, specifically when it comes to institutional types of advocacy. Okay. All right. So let's look at types of advocacy. And I think this is another important one because it gets at more of this how-to, right? And recognizing first and foremost that everyone has different skill sets. They have different amounts of knowledge about how, let's say for policy, for example, and also just different levels of bandwidth, right? One of the things that I often remind myself of and am reminded of, quite frankly, when I talk to some of my colleagues and peers is, I don't have children, right? And so the amount of time that I can spend to certain things is certainly impacted by the fact that I don't have children, right? I can show up to meetings at all times of the day, right? I don't have to worry about coming home or daycare, right? So there are certain things that I can do as someone who doesn't have children that people who, right? So there are all these different levels of ability or bandwidth rather, that I think are important to understand when we're trying to figure out how to best be an advocate, right? And this kind of goes with this idea that social justice advocates should not be comparing themselves to others, right? Well, I did this, what did you do, right? It's more of a matter of identifying what you can do and understanding that that while it may not be enough to change things overall, it's certainly a part of this larger movement of social justice. Okay, so one of the types of advocacy that's really important, and I would argue that many advisors here at Missouri State do, is student advocacy. This is something that we most likely think of when it comes to advocating as an advisor. And that really has to do with connecting students with existing resources within the university context, right? So for example, if a student comes to you and with anxiety issues or is feeling depressive symptoms or other kinds of concerns, then we might connect them to the counseling center. If we feel that our student is not well integrated into the university, is not really is kind of isolated. Let's say they're a student of color, for example, we might want to connect them to multicultural resources, right? So there are these specific things that we know that exist within the university context that we can connect students with, right? So that's a type of student advocacy, really important, right? But it's not particularly useful at changing larger systems or structures. There's also this idea of system advocacy. And system advocacy is the idea that you're pushing for change and creation of new resources within the university context. Okay, it's a bit more challenging because, for one, it requires an imagination, right? A sense of, well, we don't have this, but we could potentially have it. It's also difficult because it really does rely on being able to influence those people who pull those levers of power, right? One of the issues that we know, for example, is that the counseling center is overworked and burdened, right? And oftentimes, you hear it from a number of students. They don't have it takes too long for them to be seen, right? Or to get the mental health services that they may need. So while counseling center exists on our campus, it may be under-resourced, right? And so that would also be this type of system level advocacy, push for change and creation of new resources, or to make it to work better in a capacity. Right. The new multicultural resource center that they built, right, even though there was an existing one, it looks fantastic. And it actually includes newer features or functions that would be an example of a system level change, right? So that's another level of advocacy, right? Advocating at the system level, creating new resources that you then can connect students to. And perhaps the most difficult, and certainly the one that I would argue advisors work in the least for a number of reasons, that is the social political advocacy. And we probably see this as more like an individual level, like how engaged are you with politics? And essentially, it's the idea that we're lobbying politicians and are advocating for systemic changes at the higher level. So higher than the university context, right? What are we doing at the state level, community level, national level, et cetera? I want to comment here because I think oftentimes what you'll hear, and I hear this oftentimes from people, is like, well, why are we making everything political? We need to keep politics out of these things. Everything is political, right? The idea that, for example, trans youth or trans people have the right to exist is political, right? So we really need to reframe this discussion of what is political, what is not. I would argue that there's no aspect of our life that's not political, right? These are things that happen politicians shape a lot of our outcomes through policies and laws. To discuss those things, to discuss politics is very essential when thinking about how the world works, how the world plays out, right? And I think oftentimes we tend to distance ourselves from politics, thinking that it's not going to influence us. But if that is your perspective, I really want you to reflect on how privileged of a statement that might be, right? So for a lot of our trans students, for example, they're focusing on these laws because it does indeed impact them, right? And people who are like them. And so it's really easy to say that things are political and cast them aside if it's something that it's not really impacting you directly, right? So again, the most difficult type of advocacy, it requires a lot of time. It requires understanding what's going on at the political level, or the national level rather, or state level. But again, really important to understand that this is a avenue toward advocacy in order to really address some of the needs of our students, okay? Now, one thing to note, we don't need everyone to be social political advocates. We don't. Right. This kind of goes at the idea of, what is your bandwidth, right? What can you handle in any given moment? There are times, and I'm a lot more political and social in my advocacy than others, right? Depending on what's going on in my life, what I have the bandwidth of doing. So I don't want to leave here thinking that if you are just engaged in student advocacy, that you're doing something wrong. You're not. But what I am pushing is the idea of how do you do better, right, in your practice? What can you do to achieve that system level advocacy at some point or during some periods of your advising? And what could you do possibly to be more engaged at the social political level, right? So think of it more as an invitation to grow, as opposed to, if you don't do this, you're doing the wrong thing, right? Any type of these advocacies, I think, is a step in the right direction. Okay, so connected to the idea of types of advocacy is also this idea of what we call first versus second order changes. And first order changes are doing things a bit better than they have been done before. And again, these are things that are really important when it comes to moving in the right direction, right? So we identify something that doesn't work or it's inefficient, and we really want to improve it. And so what do? Well, we engage in a first order change. First order changes are usually non-threatening because they're not really calling for any kind of overhaul of anything. It's basically, how do we make this system that we agree is something that we should do? How do we make it work more efficiently, right? That's a first order change. Easiest changes to make, even though sometimes even first order changes can be difficult, especially if you have people who have an investment in the status quo, right? But generally non-threatening type of change. We also have second order changes, and those are the more threatening, more difficult changes to implement because they do require a fundamental shift in the way that an institution carries out its mission, right? So when thinking about second order changes, the types of barriers that may, the types of pushback we might get from a second order change might be something along the lines of, well, we're not looking to make any structural changes, right? We want to make a change within the existing structure that we have, but we're not looking to make any structural changes. I think that if we're trying to really address the deep-seated issues or deep-seated barriers that do exist in the university setting for our students, especially students from historically excluded groups, it does require oftentimes structural changes. Why? Well, because think about the predominantly white institution historically. There was a time when it wasn't designed for students of color, right? Historically, universities weren't designed for people from lower classes. Historically, universities weren't designed for women, right? And so if we're thinking about how are we going to really address the needs for these particular students who the university was not originally designed for, it requires structural changes. And I think oftentimes we end up getting the problems that we get, for example, Black at Mo State, because of this reluctance to look at the larger necessary structural changes that need to be made, right? We focus on the first order changes, which are good, but not nearly sufficient, right, to bring about these changes. I'll give you a quick example. Multicultural Resource Center has a really great new space that they created, but students are still having issues with the fact that there's high turnover, right? We don't have a director of multicultural programs. We haven't had a I've been here for less than 5 years, and we've had 2 directors of multicultural programs. We've had a vacancy since January of last year, I believe. No, maybe shorter than that. And it was just announced that the assistant director is leaving. So now we have 2 vacancies in multicultural programs. That's a problem, right? And I would argue that's a problem of a structural nature. Specifically, what is the culture of that office that's making it difficult to recruit and retain people who want to stay in that position, right? I might get in trouble for saying that, but I don't care, right? Ultimately, it impacts our students if they don't have staff who want to stay and work in that office, right? So we need to think about second order changes in that particular example, right? To talk about second order change, I'm going to rely on Cotter's model, which is articulated in the Pocket Guide. And actually, I can send around, if it's useful. I didn't want to put this in the PowerPoint, but I can send around, Ross, a list of some of the citations in case people want to do some further reading, including of Cotter's model. So I will summarize it, but if anyone's like me, I like to read the original sources, so for to validate. So I will certainly be prepared to send that out if it's something that people want. But Cotter had 3 steps in order to institute this larger second order change, which again calls for this fundamental transformation of institutions and how they carry out their work. And the first one is generate a climate for change. And I would argue that we do this pretty well, but we tend to stay here. Generating a climate for a change includes identifying the problem, examining data, finding partners, and setting goals. We do that all the time. Every time you complete a climate survey, for example, we are engaged in generating a climate for change, right? We know a problem exists, right? We know, right? That's not a surprise. I would argue that we find partners. Oftentimes we will partner with outside agencies. I know that a lot of the work for Facing Racism Institute, for example, bringing a lot of community partners to have discussions about these issues. And then, of course, we set goals. By the year 2025, racism will be over, for example, right? That's just a pretty lofty goal for sure. but that's an example. Right. So we do this and we stay here, I would argue. Most of what we do tends to be, kind of generating this, but we don't go beyond this oftentimes. The second step for Cotter is engaging and enabling the whole organization. And we do this by encouraging our partners that we have identified to follow through with their action plans. So not just setting these goals, but actually talking about how have we worked toward achieving this goal each step of the way. And the other important thing, and this is really important because the type of work that we're doing when it comes to social justice and overturning or changing institutions, it's a long game. And so you have to celebrate your short-term or small wins, right? I'm not a psychologist, but I know that in psychology, they oftentimes talk about the power of celebrating small wins as a way to kind of keep you motivated, especially when the journey is long and arduous, right? So that's another thing that is a part of this, right? Enabling the organization, keeping them motivated by celebrating these small wins. And then lastly, it's implementing and sustaining change. And I like the sustaining piece because it really does articulate this idea that in order to prevent it from falling back to what it was previously, you need to encourage or sustain that change through continued action. And that includes using feedback to continuously improve on the action, constantly evaluating and constantly reinvigorating or revising a particular practice to make sure that it works better or continues to work better, right? And one thing to note about these types of second order changes is that it does involve multiple people. It's not solely on the back of one particular person to do all of these things. That's why another really important part of advising for social justice is to see yourself as one of many who's advocating on behalf of your students. When I mentioned before that part of advising for social justice means identifying what are your strengths, what are your bandwidths, what can you do, what can't you do, what are you in position of doing. Another piece of that is really identifying people who are at different bandwidths than you, right? Who might be more, who might operate more on the systems level advocacy or operate more on the political advocacy. Seeing yourself as part of this larger unit as opposed to just one person who is trying to fight the powers that be, so to speak, right? So that's all that I have. I really, again, wanted to focus on providing an overview and some of these concrete ideas, concrete steps that we can do. But I also want to spend some time just talking to you all about any questions that you might have, or if it needs elaboration, anything that I had discussed going forward. But I do highly recommend checking out the social justice advising community for NACADA, because I think that they provide a really nice forum for discussing some of these things as well. So I'm going to stop my share and then we can have a conversation perhaps.
So on the chat, I know Christina had mentioned that the social justice advising community, it looks like they have monthly chats, and there may also be a listserv. So absolutely head to the NACADA website and learn more about that advising community. And then Kyler, it looks like you have a question there. I'm going to let you go ahead and read it because it may be easier for you.
So Abby also has her hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll go first, and then I'll go to the chat.
Thank you. I'm too lazy to type. Dr. K, thank you. And I love how you brought it to the structural level over and over again. And one of the things that it made me think about was, what's the best avenue for us to think about how we could strategically be structural? Meaning, are there things that we've identified, like you talked about the counseling center, that comes up over and over again with my advisees. I think about that students can't get scholarships through the foundation if they have a GPA that's under 3.0, and a lot of our struggling students don't have a GPA that high. Like, is there, what's the best route through which we can identify those structural issues that we should be collectively working on? Is that the provost's advising council? Where's that happening?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the first thing, I never like to go into these conversations assuming that people have even identified that structural barriers are worth focusing on. I think, and as I mentioned before, a lot of folks, hopefully not here, but tend to think about individual level things and that's it, right? Because it's easy to do so. And we're also, I think, any kind of like higher ed's not corporate, but any type of hierarchy, it tends to focus more on what can you do as individuals within the system as opposed to how do you change the system. So I want to name that first. The first thing is just convincing people that structural changes are needed and that they actually are more beneficial in the long run than working within the system. That's point number one. Point number two, there are a couple of places where these conversations are happening. I will say that the Provost Advising Council, for example, has different committees, and one committee they're focusing on, or one committee focuses on specifically faculty concerns and how do you encourage or incentivize faculty to be better advisors. I know that Kurt sits on that with me as well, and during that, so one structural change that I'm particularly invested in is how do we encourage faculty members, tenure track folks in particular, to be better advisors, to take advising seriously. That requires, quite frankly, for many departments, a real look at tenure and promotion procedures and policies. Oftentimes, advising is seen as being service, right? Or if it is seen as being teaching, it's like teaching with a lowercase t, like micro level super or subscript t, and there's no real guides for assessment. Right. So what does good advising look like? Right. And so that would be an example of a change, for example. There are also like I know the Preface has a diversity council that oftentimes talks a lot about specific things that we can do to support students broadly, right? And oftentimes what tends to come up in conversations like that are things like scholarships or support. So I hope I'm answering your question. I think these conversations are happening, and I would say one of the best avenues toward doing that is identifying who your faculty or staff senators might be. Oftentimes these councils have representatives from different departments or different colleges, so they can share their concerns or share some of their experiences with the broader group to strategize collectively. And then of course, listen to your students, talk to your students, and understand that oftentimes what ends up happening, if an individual student is sharing something with you, question whether or not that's something that's more of a pattern, more than as opposed to just something that one student is concerned or dealing with. See it as a pattern, perhaps, right? And so that's what I would say. Does that answer your question, Dr. TR?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'm going to read Kurt's question from the chat, and then I'll go up to Dr. Truchette. Okay, so Dr. Kyler, can you share some of the things that you identify as key barriers at this university? And you gave an example of a second order change, but any first and second order changes that you see as important? Yes, so I guess for me, what I would say, honestly, quite frankly, this is near and dear to my heart, mainly because I just see the turnover is really, really high, and it's very frustrating to me. And that's what's happening with multicultural programs. And I oftentimes think that part of it is just because, so I didn't know this, which is kind of surprising. So multicultural programs is actually in student affairs, not in diversity, the Office of Diversity, which for me is just really strange, especially given the fact that they handle a lot of the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on campus. And these are historical forces, why they decided for the offices to be arranged where they are. But I don't think it gets the priority of other offices. I think, and this is just having in conversations I've had with staff, they don't feel supported. They don't feel they have enough to do the work that they need. So one first order change in that could be perhaps in increasing funding, or maybe providing more resources for that particular office. A larger structural change, I think, and I think that the university to a certain extent does this, is the structural second order change would be seeing diversity, equity, and inclusion as more than just something that we should do because we're woke, and more something that we need to do because it encourages our students from historically excluded groups to thrive. I still think there are some who operate from this assumption that it's just something that we do because other universities are doing it, or it's the popular thing to do, as opposed to really understanding why DEI efforts are so very important. One of the biggest predictors as to whether or not a student, especially a student from historically excluded group, gets through university is a feeling of belonging and integration. And I argue that, and I think many have argued, that those types of programs that come from an office like that do increase feelings of belonging. And again, check out the Multicultural Resource Center. It's great. I walk in there and I've never seen more Black people congregated in Springfield than I have there. It's really empowering to see it. And they're just, their work, they should probably be doing more of their homework than I think they are, but that's just the professor in me. But they're talking about things, right? They're just, really engaging with each other. There's a sense of belonging there. And I think that that is a prime example of where efforts might be. And of course, I think that if we were to institute a second order change in the sense of we're seeing diversity, equity, and inclusion as important, not just because it's something to do, but rather because we see it as instrumental to the success of all of our students, not just students from historically excluded groups. And that's going to lead to more things like increased funding, right? More of a priority, perhaps even moving that office into DEI, where I think it should be, where it should be, right? That just makes more sense for me. I might get in trouble for that too, but I don't care. So I hope that gets at your question. That's something that I think is particularly pressing, but there are others as well, for sure. And then I think Randy had a question about the pocket guide. So the pocket guide is actually something that you have to purchase, but I believe, and Ross, correct me if I'm wrong, you have a copy in the advisement center, right, in the library there, I'm guessing. And so people can go there and check it out or read it. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Christina Bowles shared the link on the chat as well. It's $5 for a member of NACADA and $10 for a non-member. But we did purchase one for Kyler. So if you are interested in reading it, just reach out to either me or Laura, and we can make sure that you have an opportunity to review it.
And then Dr.
I was going to say I cleaned up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Hey, Julie.
I'll just be fast. I'm one of those people, it's a bit of a comment and a question. I was just curious, I think so much of what you're talking about in terms of change, I think can come from faculty. And I know the faculty sometimes feel, I know at least I'll say I feel sometimes powerless against sort of the powers that be in affecting change, but I also think a lot of it needs to come from students. And so I think I think part of our role is also empowering students and supporting students, because the administration in the end, I think will often listen to students quicker than they will listen to faculty. I think that's just kind of the nature of what the university sort of dynamic is. And so I guess the question then is sort of, could you speak, I guess, to how you see that relationship and students' role within this as well, in terms of affecting the change that they want to see, and then our role in supporting or nurturing, those paths. And I'm happy to speak with you more about this later if we're running out of time. Thank you so much for this, Kyler, by the way.
Yeah, sure. And I think that's a really important question. I think it gets back at that savior idea, right? So, and you're right. I think that at the end of the day, oftentimes, money talks, right? They pay tuition. You want to make sure, the university might listen to their students because it impacts their bottom line. I will say that faculty oftentimes have more power, especially tenured faculty, oftentimes have more power than staff. In terms of advocating for some of these things, right? There's a protection there that I think, at least maybe I'm naive in thinking that, but I think there's protection there. But I think your broader point is absolutely correct. It's about how do we empower students to address those necessary changes. And I think part of it is educating students on how universities work, right? So for example, I was advising some students, and shout out to Dr. Ashley Payne, for example, by the way, who is, I think, currently advising all of the Black student organizations on campus, which, major time investment. But I think something that Dr. Payne does very well, and other people that I know who advise student groups do very well, is they educate students on what are the proper avenues or channels to go through when you're trying to get changes done, right? So for example, during the Black at Mo State, there are all these calls for, President Smart to resign, for example, or, institute these different changes. And we're thinking about, for example, ideas of how do we increase, number of Black faculty, or how do we increase the number of, which certainly gets into the idea of belonging and feeling integrated. Those are decisions that are made at a smaller level, like the college level, right? So understanding that deans set the budget, deans set the priorities in terms of who they want to hire, et cetera, right? And so I think part of it's educating students to know who are the proper people to talk to, who operates those levers of power, as opposed to everything that happens in the university is decided by the president, for example, right? So that's one piece. And I think the other piece is when you're advocating for it, really keep the student piece front and center, right? I think this needs to be done because of, and then keep students there. So as long as you're couching, I think there's not a problem with faculty doing it, as long as they're continuously couching it in the well-being of their students. I'm a big data nerd. I believe in collecting data. So when you're coming to them, maybe having, either qualitative types of data or quantitative data to be able to share with people and say, hey, this is what's going on. But yeah, I think the empowerment piece is really important in making sure that students know that they can and should advocate for themselves, right? Something else that I noticed is that oftentimes students tend to think that there might be retaliation, or there's just this sense of fearing what might happen to them, right? Or I don't have time to advocate, right? Because I have a final or a midterm coming up. So I think it's just this constant renegotiation of what's on the advisor, staff, or faculty side versus what the student's responsible for, is what I think, right? But yeah, I think that's a really important question. So I'm glad I got a chance to at least dig into it. And I do look forward to a future conversation with you, Julia, on how we can do that better.
Okay. Kyler, again, thank you for joining us today, and participants, thank you for being here and taking this step in learning how to be a social justice advocate, how to begin this process as all of us as advisors want students to feel welcome. So thank you for being here. Continue to look forward to additional advising opportunities on numerous topics, most importantly, our diversity area. So Kyler, thanks again. Thanks for being here, and hopefully I'll see many of you next Tuesday at our next advisor forum.